Hopkins' great nature poems of the 1870s, The Wind Hover, God's Grandeur, Spring, show a man very much attuned to the external world. The idea being that the external world, let's call it the world of nature, is properly seen a manifestation of God's grandeur, God's power, God's beauty, God's grace. That God is manifest in the creatures that he created. And the way to appreciate this inscape, God's manifestations of himself in individual creatures, is through what Hopkins calls in stress, an ecstatic, immediate, highly emotional apprehension of the individual creatures and the way that they manifest the divine. The poems Hopkins writes about his in stresses of inscape are ecstatic. The Wind Hover, there is not a poem more ecstatic in the language. It's just electric, dynamic. The language is so charged. It's as if the poem itself will leap off the page. Well, in 1884, Hopkins was transferred from various posts. He was in Wales for a time in the 1870s. He had some time in Lancashire, had some time in Liverpool. He was shuffled around a good bit in the 1870s, early 1880s. He was even in London for a time, even in Oxford for a time, I think Manchester for a time. He was moved around a lot. But he always had access to natural scenes. And these scenes, as we see in his journals and as we see in his poems, seem to nourish him. But in 1884, he was transferred to Dublin, and he was appointed a professor of classics at University College in Dublin. And this was a very dark time for Hopkins. He died soon later. He died quite young. First of all, as an Englishman in Ireland, an Ireland that was becoming increasingly aware of the pernicious colonialism of England, an Ireland that was becoming more opposed to England. In this situation, Hopkins felt alienated. He felt alone. He felt isolated. He did not get on well with the Dubliners because of the differences between the Irish and the English. Not only that, the students he was teaching were not very good. They were unruly. He didn't get on very well with them. He wasn't a very good teacher, apparently. He had to spend a lot of time just grading Latin and Greek exams in the languages, Latin and Greek. So this exhausted him. It was not very satisfying. So alienation from the culture in Dublin, alienation from his students. But not only that, we can speculate that Hopkins at this time was also lamenting the fact that he didn't have much energy left to write poetry. He had to spend so much time grading the papers and teaching that he just didn't have energy left to write like he wanted to. But not only that, he'd written some amazing poems by this point, and nothing had been published, and he'd pretty much given up on being published. So perhaps he was in a crisis state over his poetic calling as well. Fourth, Hopkins was always of a melancholy turn. I mean, this is, just think about it. If you're living the life of a priest, not that I would know, I've never done that, but I can imagine that, yes, if one's faith is strong, one feels charged with the divine and feels the joy of being connected with the Godhead. But also, I can imagine there's a lot of loneliness, and I imagine that celibacy could possibly from time to time be problematic. I don't know, I'm simply speculating here. I'm probably just speaking out of my league on this, but it just seems that Hopkins at this point in his life was at the end of his tether. He was not finding energy from the places he once found energy. He was dead, and he fell into a deep, deep, deep depression. And out of this depression rose 6 sonnets exploring the depression. These are known as the terrible sonnets. And we have some in our collection in our Norton anthology. We have I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. We have carrying comfort, and we have no worse there is none. Now these sonnets are in some ways directly opposite to the great nature sonnets of the 1870s. If we again look at Windhover, it's a poem about connection, understanding, ecstasy. These poems are about the opposite. They're about the solipsism of deep depression. How when we are deeply depressed, we simply cannot connect with the world outside of our own skin. We feel isolated. We feel trapped, as it were, within our own skin, as if no one can understand our pain. And our pain is usually so intense that we simply don't have the energy to reach out and try to connect with other people. It's difficult to feel empathy, sympathy, compassion when you're so consumed with your own interior pain. So these poems seem to be utterly lacking in inscape, utterly lacking in stress. The poet cannot reach outside of his own skin, as I'm saying, to connect with the outside world because he's so consumed by the pain of his sorrow. And therefore, he's unable to have that ecstatic awareness of the outside world. His awareness is only an awareness of his pain. And ultimately, that awareness does nothing. It's static. He feels pain, he's aware of the pain. He feels more pain, he's aware of the pain. He feels more pain, he's aware of the pain. So as opposed to the dynamism of the world of the Windhover, there's a stasis to these poems. And also, another thing to note is that a poem like the Windhover, it's constantly shifting in image patterns, but I think there's an exuberance of creativity there. We also have shifts, strange shifts of image patterns in these terrible sonnets, but they don't so much suggest an exuberance of an enthusiastic mind making startling analogies. It's more a bewildered mind, a befuddled mind, a confused mind, not quite being able to think straight. So I'm going to look briefly at one of these terrible sonnets just to give you a sense of the world that Hopkins is exploring. And this is the sonnet "No Worse There Is None." So look at the first four lines. No worst there is none, pitched past pitch of grief, more pangs will, schooled at four pangs wilder ring. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? There is no worst. There's no bottom to this despair. I can never say this is the worst I'll feel because there's always something worse than this worst. So the pain is endless. So he's pitched past the pitch of grief. Just when he says, okay, this is what grief is, he's pitched into a more intense form of grief. And on and on. And more pangs will come, and they've been schooled in four pangs. So it's just a world of pain and more pain and more pain. And each time he is wilder wrung. So the pain is as if he's being squeezed and twisted. Now notice the diction here. No, none. There's a repetition of those sounds as well as the repetition of the concept of negation. Pitched past pitch, the P sounds of the alliteration, as well as the repetition of the word pitched. We have the word pangs show up twice in the second line, and then we have wilder ring. There's that alliteration there. So there's repetition here, but this is not repetition that is comforting. This is repetition that just suggests endlessness of the same thing happening over and over again, and there's no comfort coming. So then there's this odd shift in the second octave, where suddenly he goes from describing his pain, his endless pain, to describing his laments, his cries. My cries heave herds long, huddle in a main, a chief woe, world sorrow, on an age-old anvil wince and sing, then lull, then leave off. Fury had shrieked, no lingering, let me be fell, force, I must be brief. This is odd. This is just a mind that has no logic, that has no continuity. He suddenly tries to understand his pain as if it's an example of some kind of world pain, that my cries feel like a collective cry of a whole herd. suggesting that I'm crying, but maybe I'm part of a whole group that's crying. Maybe I'm manifesting a world sorrow, a sorrow that everybody feels. Maybe I'm not really alone after all. Maybe I'm on an age-old anvil, and I'm being banged on this anvil, so I wince and sing. Notice that the sing here connects to the ring in the octave above, ringing, not only suggesting being rung, but also the ringing of a bell. So I have some sound imagery here. So maybe that's it. That would be good, wouldn't it? That I'm not alone. I'm an example of some kind of great suffering. We're all Christians. We all suffer, and that's what's going on here. But then this odd, like in the right in the middle of line 7, then lull, then leave off. Fury had shrieked, no lingering, let me be fell for someone. What does that mean? Fury had shrieked. Is this suggesting that if I were able to have fury, if I were able to, Fury had shrieked. That seems to suggest if Fury had shrieked, then it would say, no lingering. Let me just lament and be done. So is that a wish that he could just stop lamenting? That's odd. When clearly the whole poem is a kind of lament. So there's this desire to just be destroyed almost. But fury, that he has no fury. The depression doesn't seem to be connected with fury. If there is such a thing as fury and depression, it's inwardly directed. Could this fury be the mythological, the pagan mythological figure Fury, who comes to wreak justice for those who have transgressed? But again, it's a fantasy. If Fury had shrieked, if a Fury had come and ended my cries, maybe that would be good, but that's not happening. So there's a jerkiness. There's a sense of a fragmented mind here, and then suddenly we go into another realm entirely in the sestet. Oh, the mine has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful sheer, no man fathomed. Hold them cheap, may who ne'er hung there. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, creep, wretch, under a comfort serves in a whirlwind. All life death does end, and each day dies with sleep. So now suddenly we're pulled into the inside of the speaker's mind. And it's this huge space of cliffs and mountains, and he's imagining himself hanging there over this great abyss. It's horrifying. So we've gone from this tiny image of an anvil to this expanded image of being inside of a head that's this massive mountainscape with cliffs. And he says, look, if you've not hung there, you don't know what you're talking about. You may think this is cheap. You may think that I'm not really describing anything terrible if you've not hung there. So there's a moving back to that isolation. This is my mind. I only know what it's like to hang there. But then he says, you know what? We don't have much endurance to hang there very long. So he moves back to the collective. We can't hang there very long. So you can see this is a speaker yearning for connection with something beyond himself. We can't hang there long. Well, then what do we do? Now he puts himself back on the ground, and he likens himself to a creeping animal. Here, if you cannot hold up in the steep or the deep, if you can't hold on to the cliff or the mountain, even though it's horrifying, you lack the strength to do that, are you going to fall through the abyss? No. Nothing so grandiose and sublime as that, tragic though it might be. You're just going to creep like an animal underneath the comfort that serves in a whirlwind. So it's almost like he's gotten into a sleeping bag or under a cover, and it protects him from some kind of whirlwind, which isn't much protection at all, but he's trying to cocoon here. I'm like a creeping animal. So this really degrading image of himself. And what does he want? He wants death. He says, death ends all life. Oh, if there is any hope, it is in that I will die. And each day dies with sleep. If there is any hope, it will be that I will sleep and I won't feel this pain anymore. So it's an ironic hope. The hope is that I will die or fall asleep. But interestingly, the poem itself suggests that he has not died. He's not fallen asleep. So the poem itself is a ringing. The poem itself is a singing that grows from the pain. So ironically, this poem about the inability to express, the inability to connect, is itself a profound expression of the pain that connects with the readers. So this is the irony of the terrible sonnets. Like the crisis odes we saw in Wordsworth and in Keats, that the poem itself, being about failure, ironically succeeds in expressing the failure in such a way that the writer can imagine connecting with readers beyond himself, and therefore hopefully feel some relief from the pain of the loneliness.